In a secluded village nestled between the edge of a thick forest and a stretch of red earth, life moved to the rhythms of the sun, the moon, and the voices of the ancestors. The people of this village held their traditions with iron hands, believing that everything, births, deaths, dreams, carried signs from the unseen world. They lived simply, farming yams, weaving cloth, and telling stories by firelight. And at the center of many whispered stories was a girl named Adana. Adana had eyes like storm clouds, soft and quiet, but hiding something ancient. She was neither too tall nor too short, neither too bold nor too meek, but there was something in her presence that stirred a person's spirit. Born on a night when the moon vanished completely from the sky, her mother died in childbirth, leaving the infant to be raised by an old herbalist woman named Mama Neka. No one knew who Adana's father was. Some said he was a traveling spirit disguised as a man. Others said her mother had been cursed, and the child born from her womb carried the mark of the ancestors. From a young age, Adana spoke to trees. She could sense when rain would fall or when someone in the village was close to death. Birds landed on her shoulders as if summoned, and goats followed her even when she didn't offer food. Mama Neka said it was a blessing. Some villagers believed it too, especially the sick who came to her for herbs and guidance, and the lonely children who sat by her as she sang lullabies that calmed even the wildest toddler. But envy grows easily in tight places, and not all hearts welcomed her light. Some of the elder women, sharp-eyed and bitter-tongued, watched her with quiet disdain. "She is too perfect," one muttered while grinding millet. "No one should be born without a flaw," another hissed. Even the chief's wife, who once praised Adana for saving her from a fever, began warning her daughters to stay away. "She smiles like a girl," she whispered once, "but there's something behind it. Something not of this world." It didn't help that the young men of the village looked at Adana the way sunflowers turn to the sky. Not because she wore fine clothes, she didn't, or because she flirted, she never did. It was the way she moved, the calm she carried, the kindness she offered without asking anything in return. Some said she had no temper, but that wasn't true. Adana could be fierce if someone harmed an animal or insulted Mama Neka. Yet even her anger was measured, like a wave that crashed and retreated before destroying the shore. But what truly set tongues wagging was the mark, small, crescent-shaped, right beneath her left shoulder blade. No one ever saw it unless she bathed in the river and turned away. Yet the elders whispered. They called it the mark of return, an ancient symbol said to belong to those who do not stay buried. Legends spoke of such souls, rare, powerful, and feared. Some said they came back to protect. Others said they came back to reveal truths the living had buried. Adana, of course, knew none of this. Or perhaps she did and simply chose not to speak. Her days were filled with tending herbs, weaving baskets, and helping Mama Neka heal the sick. She laughed softly, danced during festivals, and sang to the trees when she thought no one listened. But even in her laughter there was an echo. A weight. As though she knew that her story, like the forest that bordered the village, held secrets waiting to be unearthed. And the village, with all its customs and its silences, held its breath. Because deep down they knew, Adana was not just a girl. She was a beginning. Or an ending. Or both. Adana's presence had always stirred a quiet awe, but as seasons passed, that awe began to turn. At first, her talents were met with admiration, soft-spoken thank yous when fevers broke, when barren women conceived after sipping her bitter teas, when a child lost in the woods was found huddled beside a sleeping deer, safe and unharmed. The villagers told themselves she was blessed. But blessings that come too often, too easily, begin to disturb the balance of ordinary life. And in a village bound by tradition and fragile pride, too much light casts long, uneasy shadows. The first to feel the sting of Adana's quiet power was Madame Majoke, the wife of the wealthiest palm wine tapper. Once the village's go-to for healing and guidance, her visits began to dwindle as people trickled, instead, to Mama Neka's hut, to Adana. Her pride, once plump and gleaming like a calabash in sunlight, began to crack. It started subtly, a side comment at the well, a snide remark during a festival. "Even herbs in the wrong hands can poison," she said once, while grinding pepper beside two younger women. But the turning point came during the drought. The rains failed for 3 moons and the crops withered. Goats miscarried. Children grew thin. At a village gathering, Adana softly offered that the ancestors were restless, that the land had been angered, not by neglect but by dishonesty. She said nothing more, offered no names. But the words fell heavily into the crowd and whispers bloomed. The next day, Elder Okuta visited Madame Majoke. He was a man of many secrets. Land deals carved in silence, missing goats, a family altar that had not been tended in years. His power came not from wisdom but from fear. And now that fear had a name, Adana. She is turning hearts, he said, his voice low. Even the children avoid my shadow. That girl speaks too much without saying anything. That is dangerous. Ajoke nodded slowly. Her eyes had lost their softness. Together they began to spin the web. They started with doubt. She cured a child, but what if she planted the sickness first? She speaks to animals. Is that natural? She walks the forest paths at night. What does she seek there? They gathered a small circle of discontented hearts. Those who envied her quiet power, feared her intuition, or simply resented that a girl born without title could stand taller than them all. They fed the village stories in bits and pieces, careful not to accuse outright. That would come later. For now they let fear simmer. One morning an old man woke screaming from a nightmare. He claimed Adana had stood at the foot of his bed, her eyes glowing, her fingers dripping wet soil. The villagers gasped, though some said he had been drinking palm wine before dawn. Another day, a child claimed Adana's shadow moved while she stood still. Each tale, absurd on its own, began to gather weight. Then came the bird. A raven, rare in that region, landed on the chief's roof during a council meeting. It croaked once, then flew away. Adana was seen walking past moments later. Elder Okuta seized the moment. A sign, he declared. Our ancestors are warning us. The chief, an aging man growing weary of disturbances, hesitated. He had once trusted Adana, even sent her herbs for his sister. But power fears what it cannot control, and doubt, once planted, grows fast. By the end of the moon cycle, the whispers had become declarations. She is not a healer, said Madame Ajoke, standing at the market square, her voice trembling with fury dressed as righteousness. She is a witch who hides behind herbs and smiles. No one defended Adana that day. The villagers looked away, down, anywhere but into her eyes. Back at her hut, Adana sat with Mama Neka, who said nothing, only reached for her hand and held it. A bird landed on the windowsill and chirped once. I know, Adana whispered, her voice steady despite the crack in her chest. They are afraid. Outside, the sky darkened as clouds gathered, not with rain but with warning. The day of the feast dawned bright and deceivingly beautiful, the kind of day the ancestors might paint to cloak dark intentions. Birds sang, the market buzzed with life, and laughter spilled from the mouths of those who had spent the past weeks planting suspicion like weeds. In the heart of the village, preparations hummed, banana leaves were washed and laid, cassava boiled, goat meat roasted on open fires, and barrels of palm wine tapped fresh from the tallest trees. Madame Ajoke led the preparations with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. It is time we honored our special daughter, she announced to the crowd, her voice smooth like palm oil. Adana has given so much. It is only right we celebrate her birthday. There were nods and murmurs of agreement, some genuine, some fearful, and many uncertain. Yet no one spoke against it. After all, wasn't it just a gesture of goodwill? Adana was surprised when the invitation came. A group of village children, some of whom she had helped with rashes, fevers, and bad dreams, ran to her hut, faces flushed with excitement. Come, Adana. There's a party for you, they chirped. Everyone will be there. She smiled, though a strange heaviness clung to her chest like a damp cloth. That morning she had awakened from a dream, one that lingered, heavy and unreadable. In it she had seen a river that split in two, one clear, one dark and silent. At its center floated a gourd, cracked but glowing from within. Still, when she stepped out in her simple wrapper and her beaded necklace, Mama Neka looked at her long and hard. Are you sure? She asked. They say it is a celebration, Adana replied, her voice calm but slow. And perhaps it is. Even a goat smiles on the way to the market. She chuckled softly, masking the weight in her spirit. Mama Neka nodded once, then handed her a sprig of bitter leaf and whispered, Keep this close. At the village square, drums were already beating. Fires crackled. Children danced. The elders sat in a neat circle, the chief in his ceremonial red hat watching with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Adana's arrival was met with applause. Women ululated. Men raised gourds and toast. It was a show, a perfect performance. Adana bowed her head, greeting them all with quiet grace. When she sat, a servant girl brought her a special gourd of palm wine. It was decorated more ornately than the others, tied with a red string. Madame Ajoke stood. For the one who has healed our sick, who brings light to our darkest days, we drink in your name. The crowd repeated the chant. To Adana. But just as she lifted the gourd, Adana felt it again, that tug in her chest. A shadow darted at the edge of her vision. Her skin prickled. She looked down at the wine, its surface too still. Her fingers trembled. In that moment time seemed to pause. She could have declined. Could have smiled politely and passed it on. But the eyes of the entire village were on her. Her refusal would confirm every whisper, every rumor. That she thought herself better. That she was different. That she had something to hide. So she drank. The crowd erupted in cheer. Music swelled. Adana smiled, but her eyes, if anyone had truly looked, were distant. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the earth, Adana began to feel it. A tightness in her throat. Heat in her belly. Then cold. Her vision blurred. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed quietly beside the fire, her head resting on the ground like a sleeping child. Madame Ajoke rushed forward with a scream. She's fainted. The sun must have gotten to her. The villagers gathered, murmuring, shaking their heads in feigned concern. Elder Okuta examined her and declared gravely, "It is the will of the gods. Sometimes even the gifted fall." They wrapped her gently in white cloth and placed her in the grove where ancestors were laid to rest, just before the moon rose. No one noticed the bitter leaf sprig tucked into her fist. Or perhaps they did and chose not to ask. They worked quickly under the guise of grief. Before the first rooster's cry, the conspirators gathered at the edge of the sacred burial grove. The air was too still. The soil, damp from an earlier rain, released a heavy scent that clung to the skin and stirred unease in the few villagers who had followed to pay final respects. But even that crowd was small, too small for someone like Adana. She would have wanted a quiet burial, Elder Okuta announced, his voice solemn but clipped. The illness came too fast. It is best we do not delay her journey to the ancestors. No drums were played. No sacred chants echoed through the village as tradition demanded. No priestess was summoned to bless her soul. Instead, 4 men with blank faces lowered her wrapped body into the shallow grave. The white cloth covering her was still damp, stained faintly at the chest. Beside the grave, Adana's closest friend, Nena, stood frozen, her fingers trembling inside her wrapper. Something wasn't right. Nothing was right. Where were the elders who always gathered for final rites? Where was the palm oil to anoint her feet? Where was the woman who was supposed to sing her soul into the afterlife? It all felt rushed, staged, wrong. And worse still, Nena had felt it in her bones. The moment Adana collapsed, she knew something had happened that couldn't be explained by mere illness. Her friend's smile at the feast had been too tight. Her hands had trembled slightly as she held the wine. And then there was the silence, the suffocating silence. Not even the crickets had chirped after she fell. As the last of the soil covered the grave, Nena stepped forward, daring to speak. "Did the priestess approve the spot?" she asked softly. Madame Ajoke's lips tightened. "She did. She wasn't seen all day," Nena said more firmly this time. "I went to her hut. It was empty." Elder Okuta waved a hand. "She must have been called elsewhere. The spirits know where to find their own." But Nena wasn't satisfied. That night, she returned to her own hut without speaking to anyone. She sat in the corner by the hearth, staring at the wall, arms wrapped around herself as if the warmth could bring answers. Then came the realization that truly chilled her. The moon had not risen. She stepped outside, clutching her shawl against the night breeze. The sky above was cloudy, yes, but even through cloud cover, the moon's glow usually pressed through. That night there was nothing. Only blackness. No light. No sound. As if the heavens themselves had turned their face away from the village. Nena knelt, pressing her forehead to the earth. "What happened to you, Adana?" she whispered. Others in the village noticed things too, small things. Chickens refused to return to their coops. Dogs howled without reason. The healer's herbs wilted overnight, no matter how much water they were given. Children had bad dreams. Some whispered of a glowing gourd floating in a dark river. One boy told his mother, "The forest is watching. It's not done." But fear silenced tongues. Everyone had seen who was involved in Adana's burial, and no one wanted to be next. The village moved on, uneasily, returning to routine with eyes averted and mouths shut tight. Only Nena kept vigil. Each night, she returned to the edge of the grove. Not to cry, Adana wouldn't want that, but to watch. To listen. She left wildflowers on the spot where her friend was buried. She hummed the lullabies they used to sing as children. She whispered secrets into the soil. And still the moon did not return. Inside many hearts, the question echoed, had they buried a girl, or something more? Because if Adana truly carried the mark of return, as the elders once whispered, then maybe the earth had not claimed her yet. Maybe something else had. The seventh night came heavy with heat and a strange tension in the air. The village square bustled with music, laughter, and overflowing pots of steaming jollof rice, grilled fish, and palm wine flowing like a river. Lanterns swung from trees and children darted between dancers, their laughter sharp against the drumming. The Feast of New Beginnings, they called it, a celebration to honor life and move forward. But everyone knew it was a distraction. It was orchestrated by those who had spoken loudest after Adana's burial, Elder Okuta, Madam Ajoke, and a few others whose smiles had grown wider and more brittle by the day. They claimed the village needed joy to forget the tragedy, that Adana herself would have wanted happiness in her wake. It was a lie polished into ceremony. Madam Ajoke stood tall in her bright orange wrapper, beaded hair tied up like royalty. She made a show of serving palm wine, smiling so wide it hurt to look at. Her voice rang over the crowd. To fresh beginnings, to peace, to a future unclouded. A hesitant cheer went up. But beneath the surface of celebration, unease festered like an unhealed wound. The children played quieter than usual. The dogs refused to come near the square. Nena stood in the shadows, arms crossed tightly, refusing food, refusing to dance. She watched it all, the glimmer of guilt in some faces, the forced laughter in others. "You should eat something," an older woman whispered, nudging a plate toward her. "It's not good to carry grief so tightly." Nena didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the western sky, where thick, ink-black clouds were curling in like fingers. As the music climbed, thunder cracked. It wasn't just far-off thunder. It rolled through the village like a drum of warning. The dancers faltered slightly, but the elders signaled the drummers to keep going. "It is just a storm," someone muttered. "We are celebrating after all." Still, people began to glance upward more frequently. The air had grown too still, too heavy. The wind held its breath. Then the palm trees began to sway, not gently but sharply, as if something unseen was moving through them. At the head table, Elder Okuta lifted his calabash in another toast. "Let the past stay buried. Let the ground keep what it has taken." A second thunderclap answered, this one louder, closer. The lanterns flickered violently. Nena took a step forward. The smell changed, away from food and fire toward wet soil. The scent of something dug up. And then came the moment that silenced everything. The main drum cracked, not a beat but a break. The head snapped right through, the skin flapping loose. The drummer stared at it, wide-eyed. The music stopped. Someone screamed. Because just beyond the edge of the square, at the path that led to the sacred grove, a figure had appeared. Barefoot. Clothed in white. Hair damp with soil and rain. Eyes open, shining in the torchlight. Adana. Her skin was streaked with mud. Her dress was torn at the hem. But her posture was firm, tall, unshaken. Around her, the wind spiraled gently, carrying the scent of wild herbs and something deeper, older. She took a step forward. Then another. Voices broke around her like splinters. Some fell to the ground in shock. Some tried to run, only to trip on their own guilt. But Adana said nothing. She walked forward with the silence of the grave behind her. Madam Ajoke dropped her wine. Her lips moved but no sound came. Elder Okuta stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Children hid behind their mothers. The drummers abandoned their instruments. Nena did not move. She stood at the edge of the crowd, tears welling. Not from fear but from awe. Because in Adana's return, she saw truth. She saw that justice did not always shout. It sometimes walked quietly, barefoot, from the earth. And above them, the thunder gave one last growl, before the clouds parted. And the moon, absent for 7 nights, finally returned. The thunder rolled across the sky, a slow, rumbling promise of something yet to come. The air crackled with the last echoes of a celebration that had swiftly lost its luster. The feast had been lively, too lively perhaps, but now the silence that filled the village square was heavier than the storms that brewed in the distance. It was then, amidst the stillness, that a figure appeared in the shadowed doorway of the village square. A figure so strikingly out of place that the world seemed to hold its breath. Adana. She stepped into the circle of light cast by the remaining lanterns, her feet bare against the cold earth. The dust of the road clung to her ankles, streaking the ground with marks of her journey. Her clothes were simple, white, flowing, and stark against the darkening backdrop of the feast. She looked as though she had been walking for days, her hair tangled with twigs and leaves, but her face was unmistakable. The same face that had been loved, envied, and now feared. Her eyes, the eyes that had always been warm with kindness and wisdom, now burned with a fire that none of them could comprehend. They were no longer the eyes of a sweet, gentle girl. They were the eyes of someone who had seen death and returned from it. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wildfire. "Adana?" someone whispered, and that single word seemed to echo across the square, a question that no one could answer. The music had stopped, the clamor of the feast had faded, and all that was left was the sound of the wind, stirring the dust around her feet. Some of the villagers took a step back, others froze in place as though rooted to the earth. It was Madame Ebel who recovered first, her hand instinctively reaching for the gourd at her side, her face painted with a mixture of disbelief and terror. How is this possible?" she gasped, her voice trembling, barely audible over the sharp gusts of wind that seemed to swirl around Adana, carrying the scent of the wilds with it. You were dead." The others murmured in shock and confusion. Some turned to Elder Obinna, who stood, his face pale and lips trembling. The laughter had long since died from his mouth. The once strong man now appeared as though his very legs would buckle beneath him. But he said nothing, his eyes wide, his mouth agape, unable to find words. Adana's gaze swept over the crowd, her eyes piercing through the thick veil of fear and disbelief. She didn't look like the same girl they had known. Her skin, once radiant, was now pale, marked with a sickly gray tint. Her body bore the faintest traces of the poison they had fed her. The pallor of death still clung to her, but it was as though death itself had given up its hold on her. She stepped forward. The villagers shrank back, some crying out, others simply standing frozen, afraid to move as though they were waiting for the ground beneath them to swallow them whole. But Adana did not acknowledge them. She did not look for sympathy or justice. Her eyes were focused only on the center of the square, on the people who had conspired to end her life. One by one, the conspirators felt her gaze like a weight on their souls. Madame Ebel, standing at the forefront, finally took a trembling step backward. Her face drained of color, her mouth working to form words she couldn't speak. Elder Obinna stood in the background, his eyes wide, his hands shaking at his sides. No one had expected this. No one had prepared for it. Adana's presence was a challenge, an overwhelming force. She walked toward them slowly, deliberately, as if she were walking into the very heart of the storm. Each step she took seemed to pulse with a quiet power, as though she were not merely walking, but reclaiming every inch of the earth beneath her feet. Her head held high, her hands clenched at her sides, she radiated an aura that could not be ignored. Finally, her voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You thought you could bury me," she said softly, her words carrying across the square with a weight that seemed to make the ground tremble beneath her. "You thought you could erase me from this world, from your memories? But you were wrong. I am not so easily forgotten." Her voice, though calm, was laced with something far deeper, a quiet strength, an unshakable power that sent a chill through every soul present. Adana was no longer the girl they had once known. She was something else now, something ancient, something forged in the fire of death itself. One of the villagers, a young man who had once been her friend, stepped forward hesitantly. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his voice trembling. "But how are you alive?" Adana's gaze flickered over him, but she did not answer directly. Instead, her eyes swept over the crowd again, lingering on the faces of those who had plotted her demise. "I returned because I was not meant to die," she said, her words deliberate, her tone unwavering. "What you did to me was not just a crime against me. It was a crime against the very balance of this village, against nature itself. And the ancestors have not forgotten." A gust of wind howled through the square, sending the lanterns swaying dangerously. A crack of lightning lit up the sky, and for a moment, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. Adana continued, her voice steady and strong. "I am not here for revenge," she said. "I am here to restore what you took, to return what you tried to bury." And with that, she turned and began to walk away, her feet light against the earth, the village square fading into the distance behind her. As she disappeared into the darkness, the villagers remained rooted in place, their minds spinning with confusion and fear. What had they just witnessed? Had Adana truly returned from the dead? What did it mean? They did not know yet. But they would soon learn. The storm that had been rumbling in the distance now roared overhead, as though the heavens themselves were bearing witness to what was about to unfold. The wind howled through the village square, twisting the dry dust into whirlwinds that danced around Adana's feet as she stood before the conspirators. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the entire world was pausing, waiting for her next words. Adana stood tall, her back straight and her eyes unwavering. The poison, the grave, the betrayal, these were not the things she focused on. She did not carry the weight of vengeance in her heart. Her mission was not fueled by anger, but by something far greater. Her return was not for the sake of punishment, it was for the sake of awakening. The crowd, still frozen in a state of disbelief, watched as she took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her voice when it came was calm, eerily so. "I do not seek revenge," she began, her eyes sweeping over the villagers, each face reflecting a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "I am not here to make you suffer for what you have done. I am here to open your eyes to the truth of what you tried to bury." Her voice rang out, steady and clear, cutting through the wind and the tension in the air. As she spoke, she did not shout or raise her voice. There was no fury in her words, just a quiet, unshakable conviction. "To you, Madame Ebel," she said, her gaze settling on the woman who had been the mastermind behind the plot, "you feared what you could not control. You envied me because the earth seemed to bend to my will. You could not accept the gifts I had been given, so you sought to take them away." Madame Ebel flinched at her name, her face turning pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The power in Adana's voice seemed to have stolen her words, leaving her unable to respond. She looked down at her feet, ashamed, unable to meet the eyes of the girl she had tried to destroy. Adana's eyes then shifted to Elder Agwu, an old man who had once been a pillar of the village, but now stood crumpled in the face of Adana's return. "And to you, Elder Agwu," she continued, her tone unwavering, "you who once preached about balance and respect for nature, chose to turn your back on the very things you swore to protect. You allowed your greed to blind you. You saw me as a threat to your control over the village, so you allowed this to happen, thinking it would grant you more power." The elder shuddered under her gaze, the weight of her words sinking into his bones like an invisible burden. His hands shook, his face a mask of guilt. He could not look Adana in the eye, and he could not find a way to deny the truth that hung in the air like a dark cloud. Adana then turned to the others, those who had quietly supported the plot, those who had let themselves be swayed by fear and jealousy. "And to all of you who stood by and did nothing," she said softly, her eyes sweeping over them all, "you let your fear of me cloud your judgment. You saw me as different, and that was enough to turn you against me. You allowed your own insecurities to dictate your actions. But the truth is, none of you could see what was happening under your noses. None of you understood the consequences of your actions." The village square was eerily quiet now, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the rising wind. No one dared to speak. The villagers stood in stunned silence, as if paralyzed by the weight of Adana's words. But Adana did not linger on their guilt. She did not wish to dwell on their sins, though they were many. Instead she pressed on. "The ancestors sent me back not to destroy but to awaken," she said, her voice ringing out clear and true. "They sent me back because the balance had been disrupted. The very spirit of this village was tainted by your actions, and it needed to be restored. What you did to me was not just a crime against me, it was a crime against the land, against the earth, against everything that keeps us alive." Her voice, though calm, carried a depth that resonated with everyone present. It was not a voice of anger, it was the voice of someone who had transcended the pain they had inflicted upon her. It was the voice of someone who had seen the world in a way that none of them could understand. "The ancestors saw what you did," she continued, her gaze unyielding. "And they saw what I could not see when I was alive. The purpose of my life, the strength within me that I could not have known without this trial. You thought you could silence me, but instead, you gave me the strength to return, to bring this village back to its senses." A single tear slipped from Adana's eye, though her face remained composed, her expression resolute. The rain had begun to fall, soft at first and then harder. It was as if the heavens themselves were cleansing the earth, washing away the sins of the past. The rain was not a punishment, it was a purification. "You cannot undo what you have done," Adana said softly, her gaze turning to the sky as the rain began to fall harder, "but you can choose to learn from it. You can choose to let this moment be the beginning of a new way, one that honors the earth, the spirits, and the wisdom of those who walk among you." As the rain poured down, the villagers fell to their knees, some in shame, some in awe, and others in silent remorse. No one spoke, for there were no words to offer. There was only the sound of the rain, and the echo of Adana's words, ringing in their hearts. Adana took one final look at the village that had betrayed her, and yet, the village that she had always called home. She did not look back at the conspirators, for they had already received their judgment. Instead, she turned and walked away, her feet once again bare against the earth, the rain washing her clean as she disappeared into the night. The villagers remained kneeling, the storm washing over them, but it was not just the rain that cleansed them. It was the truth. the truth that they could no longer deny. The days following Adana's return were filled with a strange, palpable tension. The villagers, once united in their shared guilt and shame, now found themselves at the center of a great reckoning. News of her miraculous return had spread like wildfire, not just through the village, but to the neighboring settlements, reaching distant corners of the land. Whispers of divine intervention and ancestral power reverberated through the air, and the elders knew that they could not let the matter go unresolved. The chief, a man of authority but not without a measure of wisdom, called for an emergency council meeting. The village's leaders and the elders, who had once allowed the betrayal to fester, gathered in the open square to discuss what should be done. The air was thick with uncertainty as the chief stood, his face a mask of somber resolve. "This must not go unpunished," the chief declared. His voice was strong, yet tinged with a hint of hesitation. What happened to Adana was not just a crime against one woman, it was a crime against our land, our ancestors, and everything we stand for. The elders murmured in agreement, though there were some who did so with uneasy glances. They had been complicit, yes, but now they saw that the truth was far more powerful than the lies they had chosen to believe. "We must find out what truly happened," the chief continued, "and those who were behind this must face the consequences." A decision was made swiftly, an investigation was to be launched immediately. Those who had conspired against Adana would be questioned, and the village would no longer turn a blind eye. It was clear that the severity of the crime demanded action, but what was not clear was the scope of the truth that would be uncovered. In the days that followed, each of the conspirators was summoned before the chief and the elders. One by one they were questioned, though none could escape the weight of their guilt. They were asked to confess the details of the plot, to admit their role in poisoning Adana and burying her as though she were nothing more than a casualty of their fear and envy. Madame Ebel, the ringleader, broke down first. Her once confident demeanor was shattered, and she admitted, through trembling lips, that she had been the one to orchestrate the feast, to invite Adana under false pretenses. She confessed that her jealousy had blinded her, and her fear of Adana's influence had led her to take actions that she would now regret for the rest of her life. Elder Agwu, too, confessed, though he did so begrudgingly, acknowledging that his own greed had played a part in the conspiracy. He had hoped that by ridding the village of Adana, he could solidify his own standing as a man of power. The other conspirators followed suit, each revealing their involvement, though some were clearly more reluctant than others. In the end, the full truth was laid bare. The village had been complicit in a grave injustice. They had conspired to rid themselves of a woman who had only ever sought to heal and to help. It did not take long for the chief to issue his verdict. The guilty were to be exiled from the village. The weight of their actions was too great to allow them to remain in the place they had betrayed. The chief's decision was swift, but it was not without its consequences. The villagers had learned that there were no shortcuts when it came to justice. The sacred bond between the people and their land could not be severed without retribution. As the guilty were led away from the village, the air seemed to settle, and the storm that had been brewing within the hearts of the villagers began to calm. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet sense of justice, one that hung in the air like a delicate mist. The village was healing, but it would take time. The damage done was deep, and it could not be undone overnight. The final act in this tale of betrayal and awakening came when the chief ordered the reopening of Adana's grave. It had been a place of sorrow and guilt, a symbol of the wrongs that had been done. Now it would become a symbol of something far greater, the village's recognition of its own faults and its commitment to making things right. The villagers gathered in silence as the earth was dug up, the soil parted with great care. As the lid of the grave was lifted, the moment of truth arrived. But what they found inside stunned them all. There, in the grave, were only Adana's burial cloth and a scattering of fresh herbs. Her body was nowhere to be found. The villagers gasped in shock. There was no sign of decomposition, no trace of the woman who had been buried 7 days prior. Rumors began to swirl among the crowd. Some spoke of divine intervention, of the ancestors' power at work. Others whispered that Adana had never truly died, that she had been marked by the spirits to return at this precise moment. But the most compelling theory was that Adana had been brought back by the ancestors themselves, sent to awaken the villagers to their own sins, to show them the power of the land, and to remind them of the eternal bond they shared with nature. It was said that the earth had claimed her, but it had not taken her completely. Her return was a sign that the land was alive, that the spirits were watching, and that justice, no matter how long it took, would always prevail. As the villagers pondered what they had just witnessed, a strange peace settled over them. The guilt they had carried now seemed lighter, as though it had been washed away by the rain and the sight of Adana's return. They had been given a second chance. A chance to honor the land, to honor the spirits, and to honor the woman they had once betrayed. And though Adana was no longer with them, her spirit would live on as it always had, within the very soil they walked upon, in the winds that rustled through the trees, and in the hearts of those who had learned the true meaning of justice. Adana's return to the village had shaken the foundation of everything the people believed about justice, power, and the land. Yet, despite the chaos, the whispers, and the newfound reverence, she chose a path that defied the expectations placed upon her. She could have returned to claim power, to seek vengeance for the wrongs that had been done to her. She could have demanded tribute from those who had once betrayed her, and perhaps in doing so she would have become a figure of great authority, one who could rule the land with wisdom and power. But that was not the path she chose. Instead, Adana made the quiet decision to leave the village and the memories of betrayal behind. She ventured to the forest's edge, a place that had always felt like home to her. The towering trees, the soft rustle of the leaves, and the cool breeze carried the familiar scent of earth and life. It was here, amid the quiet embrace of nature, that she set up her healing house. The house was simple, made of wood and stone with windows wide open to the outside world. A thatched roof kept the rain at bay, but the walls were lined with herbs and plants that Adana had cultivated over the years. The air inside was thick with the smell of healing leaves and wildflowers. It was a humble space, but one that carried with it a deep sense of peace. It was here that she would heal not just the body but the spirit. At first, the villagers were hesitant to visit. They had heard the rumors of her miraculous return, but many still felt guilty for what they had done to her. The idea of seeking her out, after all the pain they had caused, was something that some couldn't bear. But word of her healing powers spread quickly. Those who had witnessed her return to life, or heard of the way she had so calmly revealed the truth to the conspirators, began to spread stories of her kindness, her wisdom, and the quiet strength that radiated from her. Soon, people from across the land came to her, hoping to seek her counsel or receive her healing touch. Adana did not turn anyone away. She welcomed all who came, whether they sought a cure for their ailments, wisdom for their troubles, or simply a moment of peace. Her days were spent gathering herbs, preparing remedies, and listening. She would sit for hours with those who visited, offering words of comfort, guidance, and sometimes silence, knowing that sometimes just being heard was all a person needed. She was not one to boast of her powers. In fact, she spoke little of her miraculous return or the supernatural nature of her existence. She simply went about her work, healing the sick and offering solace to those in pain. Her fame, however, grew. People came from villages far and wide to hear her speak, to learn from her, and to experience the wisdom she had gained in her years of suffering and growth. But even as her reputation spread, Adana remained humble. She never allowed her fame to change her. She had seen what power could do to people, how it could corrupt and twist even the purest of hearts. She had no desire for such power. Instead, she sought only to heal, to guide, and to help those who came to her in search of peace. Her fame was not that of a conqueror or a ruler. It was the fame of a healer, a woman who had faced the darkest trials and had emerged stronger and more compassionate than ever before. People came to her not because they feared her, but because they felt safe in her presence. They trusted her, not because she was a mystical figure, but because she was someone who understood the deepest parts of the human heart. Her reputation reached even the distant lands, and her humble healing house became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought answers to life's questions. There were no grand ceremonies, no lavish celebrations in her honor. There were only quiet moments spent with those in need, and for Adana that was enough. She knew that her work was meaningful not because of the accolades she received, but because of the lives she touched. As the years passed, Adana continued her work. She had become a figure not of power but of peace. She had transcended the desire for revenge, and in doing so she had created something far greater, an environment where healing, both physical and spiritual, could take place. Her work was not just about curing illnesses or providing remedies. It was about helping people understand themselves, their lives, and their place in the world. It was about guiding them back to a sense of balance, to help them find harmony with the earth, with each other, and with themselves. Adana's fame, though widespread, never dulled her spirit. She never allowed herself to become distant or aloof from the people who came to her. She remained grounded in the values of kindness, humility, and empathy. She never sought to be revered or feared, only to be a source of comfort and support to those who needed it most. The village that had once betrayed her now spoke her name with reverence. They no longer whispered of her death and resurrection as something to be feared. Instead, they spoke of her return as a miracle, one that had brought light to their darkened hearts and reminded them of the power of forgiveness, of humility, and of the deep connection between all living things. Adana never sought power or glory. She had transcended those desires. Instead, she chose a quiet, humble life at the edge of the forest, where she could heal the world one person at a time. And in doing so, she became more powerful than anyone could have imagined, not through vengeance or conquest, but through grace, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of peace. Years passed, and the village, once filled with whispers of doubt and fear, had slowly transformed into a place of quiet reverence. It wasn't just the physical change that occurred, the way people now interacted with each other, the way they tended to the earth, or the way they spoke of justice and healing. It was something deeper. There was a shift in the air, an almost tangible feeling of respect for life itself, a recognition that the spiritual and the physical were intertwined in ways they had not understood before. This transformation was not just about actions, it was about a change in heart, a slow awakening that Adana's presence, both known and unknown, had inspired. The elders, those who had witnessed the rise of the woman who had come back from death, sat around the fires in the evenings, telling stories of the past, of their ancestors, of things that had been lost to time. Their voices, now older, held the wisdom of years lived through trials and triumphs. Yet it was the story of Adana that lingered in the minds of many, especially the younger ones, the children who had grown up hearing her name with reverence. One such evening, as the fire crackled and the night sky above the village sparkled with countless stars, an elder sat before the gathered children. The stories of old were shared with a familiar rhythm, stories of the earth, of the spirits, of their ancestors who once walked the land. But tonight, as the children gathered closer, eager for yet another tale, the elder's voice softened, drawing the attention of all who listened. There is a story that has passed from generation to generation, one that holds a lesson deeper than all the rest. The elder began, their voice low but clear. It is the story of the girl who rose from the grave, Adana, the healer. The children's eyes widened. Adana's name was spoken with awe in the village, though most of the youngest had never known her personally. They had only heard the stories. The elder continued, their voice growing steady and thoughtful. Adana was not just a girl like any other. She was born with a connection to the earth, to the spirits, to the very heart of the land. Her birth was a mystery whispered about by the elders, but even they did not fully understand what it meant. As she grew, so too did her power, her ability to heal, to commune with the forces of nature, and to bring peace to troubled hearts. But her power, as you may know, also attracted envy and fear. And because of that fear, those who sought to destroy her did not know what they were truly doing. They saw her as a threat, but what they failed to see was that she was a force of truth. The children listened, their faces full of curiosity, some glancing nervously at one another as the elder spoke. They had heard parts of the tale before, but hearing it now, in the quiet of the evening, made it feel more real, more immediate. She was poisoned, the elder continued, betrayed by those she had trusted, buried in haste as though she were nothing more than a fleeting shadow. But the earth would not accept her death. The ancestors refused to let her go. And when the time came, the spirits returned her to us, not as a ghost but as a living truth. A small child, no older than 7 or 8, raised a hand, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. Was she a ghost? The child asked, her eyes wide with the wonder only a child could possess. The elder's gaze softened, and they smiled, their ancient eyes glimmering in the firelight. The air around them seemed to still as the elder took a deep breath before replying. No, child. She was not a ghost. She was truth. The words lingered in the air, the weight of their meaning hanging in the stillness of the night. The children were silent for a moment, each processing the elder's response in their own way. To them, a ghost was something that lingered in the shadows, an unsettling presence that did not belong. But truth was something different. Truth was unshakable, eternal, and always present, even when it was hidden from view. The elder continued, their voice now filled with reverence. Adana's return was not about revenge or punishment. It was about awakening. She was sent to remind us all that the true power of the earth, of life, is not in the things we can touch or hold. It is in the way we live, the way we treat each other, and the way we honor the land. Her presence among us was never meant to be feared. It was meant to open our eyes. The children, now caught in the weight of these words, began to understand. They had been told of Adana's miraculous return many times, but hearing it from the elder, who had lived through the days of betrayal, brought a new depth to the tale. It was not just a story about a girl who had been wronged and had come back to life. It was a story about understanding, about the power of truth, and about the resilience of the human spirit. And where is she now? another child asked, his voice small but filled with genuine curiosity. The elder paused as if considering the question carefully. She is here, the elder said, pointing upward, their eyes scanning the sky as though they could see beyond the horizon. Adana has never truly left. Her spirit, her essence, lives in the land, in the trees, in the waters, and in the hearts of those who choose to live with respect for all that is. She walks among us still, not as a ghost, but as a presence that we can all feel when we open our hearts to the earth. The children looked around, their eyes searching the night, as though expecting to see Adana standing there among the trees. But of course she was not visible. She had never been a physical presence. She had never needed to be. The elder's voice softened once more as the night grew deeper. Adana is not someone we can hold in our hands. She is the land itself, the truth that lives in every leaf, every breath of wind. She is the unspoken force that guides us toward compassion, justice, and healing. And though she may not walk among us as she once did, her story remains with us. She lives in each of us who choose to walk in the path of truth. As the elder finished speaking, the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the night sky. The children sat still, processing the depth of the elder's words. There was no need for further questions, for they understood now. They understood that Adana was not a ghost, a mere figure from the past. She was a living truth, one that could never be erased, one that would remain in the village for as long as the earth stood. The elders stood slowly, their bones creaking with the weight of years. "Remember this, children," they said, their voice carrying the gravity of all the years they had lived. "Adana may have walked into the village once, but she never truly left. She watches over us now, from the trees, from the earth. And when we live with truth, we live with her." As the elder walked away, the children sat in silence, gazing up at the stars above. They could feel it then, the presence of something greater, something beyond the physical world. Adana, the girl who had risen, was with them still, not as a ghost, but as a living truth, eternal and unshakable. And as the night wore on, the village below seemed to breathe a little easier. The ancestors were watching. Adana was watching. And the truth, in all its quiet power, would never be forgotten.